McDermott, a small, unincorporated community straddling the Nevada-Oregon border, is a town where the desert winds whisper secrets and the mountains stand as silent witnesses to history. In 1991, a year after the last mining operation had closed, the population dwindled to just 124, the majority being Northern Paiute and Shoshone people from the nearby Fort McDermott Indian Reservation. The town had become a shadow of its former self, with boarded-up buildings and dusty streets where the wind carried more than just tumbleweeds. For generations, McDermott's economy had been built on mining, ranching, and farming. The closing of the mines was a death knell that sent the town into a slow, inevitable decline. But as the residents would soon discover, economic hardship was not the only force choking the life from McDermott. Something far older, far darker, had awoken in the high desert. The first signs. It began subtly, as most dark things do. Livestock started disappearing from ranches. At first, ranchers blamed coyotes or wolves, but the mutilated bodies that were found later told a different story. No natural predator left bodies like that. Then, children from the reservation began falling ill with no discernible cause. Their once vibrant energy was sapped, replaced by listless stares and hollowed faces. Elders whispered that something from the old stories had returned. Among the Northern Paiute, stories of malevolent forces in the land were part of their ancestral lore. They spoke of the Tso'avits, a spirit of death and decay that wandered the desert, feeding on the souls of the living. The elders believed this evil force had long been buried beneath the earth, kept at bay by rituals and offerings that had fallen by the wayside as generations passed. On the night of the summer solstice, when the desert heat pressed down on the town like a heavy blanket, the winds shifted. The skies darkened unnaturally, as if the sun itself had been swallowed by the earth. It was on this night that James Reed, the last foreman of the now-abandoned McDermott mine, was found dead just outside of town, his body contorted in ways that defied explanation. Sheriff Henry Carlson, a pragmatic man who had served McDermott for over 30 years, initially dismissed the stories of curses and ancient evils. But even he couldn't ignore the increasing number of strange occurrences. Ranchers reported hearing voices in the wind, voices that weren't there. A couple driving through town claimed to see shadowy figures pacing them along U.S. Highway 95, only for the figures to vanish as quickly as they appeared. By autumn, nearly a third of the population had either died or left McDermott. The children who had fallen ill during the summer had all passed away, despite desperate efforts to save them. Doctors from Winnemucca, the nearest large town, could offer no answers. McDermott was suffocating, and no one seemed to know how to stop it. The ancient history of the land. The land around McDermott had always been harsh. Located on the Oregon high desert, it was a place of extremes, hot, dry summers and bitterly cold winters. But the Paiute and Shoshone tribes had lived here long before white settlers arrived, and they understood the rhythms of the desert. They knew that some places were to be avoided, places where the earth felt wrong, where the wind whispered warnings. The Fort McDermott Indian Reservation was located just outside the main township, and many of its residents still followed traditional ways. Tribal elders warned of a great darkness beneath the desert, a force that had been stirred from its slumber when the white settlers arrived and began digging into the land. Mining, they said, had awoken something that should have remained undisturbed. It was no coincidence that McDermott, once known as Dugout, was named after Fort McDermott, a military outpost established in 1865 to protect stagecoaches and settlers from Native American attacks. The fort had been named for Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDermott, who was killed in a skirmish with the Paiute. Some believed his death was a result of the tribe's efforts to protect the land from the encroaching settlers, but others whispered that the skirmish was not about land or cattle, but about something far older. The Paiute had long spoken of the Tso'avits, a force that wandered the desert looking for souls to consume. When the settlers built their town near the fort, they unknowingly built it on cursed land. Fort McDermott may have protected settlers from native attacks, but it did nothing to stop the deeper threat that lay beneath the desert floor. The death of McDermott. In the early winter of 1991, the situation in McDermott had grown dire. Those who hadn't fled the town were falling into despair, and the remaining population was down to just over 60. Sheriff Carlson had begun investigating the deaths with an almost obsessive determination, trying to find any pattern or explanation. But every lead went cold. It was as if the town itself was slowly eating its residents alive. One evening, as Sheriff Carlson sat in his office, going over the latest reports, an elderly woman from the reservation came to see him. Her name was Marjorie Littlefeather, one of the last remaining medicine women of the Northern Paiute. She told him about the Tso'avits, the spirit of death that had awakened beneath the town. She spoke of the mining operations that had disturbed the land, breaking the seals that had kept the evil force contained for centuries. Once it was bound by our people, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But the earth has been broken. The seals are gone. Now it feeds. Carlson, though skeptical, listened. He had seen too much over the past months to dismiss her words outright. Marjorie explained that the only way to stop the Tso'avits was to perform a cleansing ritual, something that hadn't been done in over 100 years. It required specific rites, offerings, and the participation of the community. But with the town's population dwindling, and most of the Paiute either dead or gone, there were few who could help. Nevertheless, they decided to try. The ritual. On a bitterly cold night in late December, the few remaining residents of McDermott gathered at the abandoned mine on the edge of town. Marjorie led the group in the ancient rituals, chanting in the Paiute language as they offered what little they could to the land, sacrifices of food, tobacco, and small personal items that held meaning to each person. The wind howled as they stood around a fire, the flames flickering weakly in the oppressive air. The ground seemed to hum beneath their feet, as if something deep within the earth was stirring. As the ritual progressed, the air grew thick, almost suffocating. The desert around them seemed to come alive with movement, shadows darting just beyond the edge of the firelight. The ground trembled, and the distant mountains appeared to shift, as though something massive and ancient was awakening from a long slumber. Suddenly, the fire blew out. The darkness was absolute, and in that moment, Sheriff Carlson heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from the mouth of the mine. His heart raced as he fumbled for his flashlight, but when he clicked it on, there was nothing, just the yawning blackness of the mine. Marjorie's voice broke the silence. "It's too late," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "We cannot stop it." The end of McDermott. By the time dawn broke, most of those who had participated in the ritual were dead. Marjorie was gone, her body found near the mine entrance, her face twisted in a final expression of terror. Sheriff Carlson was one of the few who survived, but he never spoke of what he saw that night. In the years that followed, McDermott became a ghost town. The last residents left in 1992, unable to bear the weight of the evil that had consumed their home. The desert slowly reclaimed the land, the town's buildings falling into ruin, swallowed by sand and time. The Northern Paiute who remained on the reservation still told stories of the Tso'avits, warning anyone who would listen not to venture too close to McDermott. They knew the land was cursed, and that the evil beneath it had not been banished, merely biding its time. McDermott may have been forgotten by the outside world, but for those who knew its history, it would always be a place of death and darkness, where an ancient force still lingered, waiting for its next victims.